So, ladies and gentlemen, the Premier has agreed to take the toughest of questions. And so make sure that you get the cards up, and I will pass these along faithfully. But as that's happening, Premier, if I might just ask you, let's talk about the Canadian energy strategy.
Right.
And Nancy spoke about the Canadian establishment and some of the people that you met when you were back east. What are Alberta's goals in a Canadian energy strategy?
Well, I think the place that I start from with the Canadian energy strategy is that we know we have resources that are probably easier to realize than most other parts of the country right now. But we also know that they are particularly vulnerable to public comment, and to ensure that we get these products to market, we're going to have to negotiate and manage through some pretty difficult situations. So when I think about that, what I know is that when we talk to people in the rest of the country, and we have to start doing that now, we need to talk about what the common interests are. And frankly, the traditional approach that Alberta has taken has been to say that we are the economic engine of the country, and that if we can put the right policies in place at a federal level, that everyone will benefit from that. Now, there are some people that understand that, but it doesn't actually resonate with most Canadians. Because at the end of the day, there's a very emotional discussion going on about the energy that we produce in this province. So we have to do two things. One is communicate differently with respect to that relationship. But the other is to do the work that's already happening in Alberta around putting in place ourselves a more integrated approach to energy. You know, we have people that are very involved in renewables, whether it's wind or solar. We have universities that are involved in research technology right now that can change the way that our energy mix works in this province. So before we go out and talk to other provinces only about how we need to have integrated energy sources, we also have to demonstrate ourselves that we can show leadership with respect to that. But the primary difference needs to be a relationship with other parts of Canada that understands that we're not a checkbook, that we're actually part of what will be, particularly I think in the next 2 years, a critical resource that's going to allow the Canadian economy to thrive in a way that many others around the world won't.
So what about the environment in all that? One of the questions we have is, what will Alberta's position be relative to the environment, the oil sands, as we go forward?
Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to talk about what we've done. We have to talk about our regulatory framework, our investment in carbon capture, the fact that we have a price on carbon, that we have a technology fund, that we've put in place policies that allow for a strong regulatory environment that ensures that we are environmentally sustainable. But the other piece to that is we have to also say to the rest of Canada that in partnership with industry, which is already happening, we will continue to strive to make our means of production more sustainable than they've been and deal with the greenhouse gas issue. Now, we can do that in cooperation, and we are doing that in cooperation with the federal government. So it's all of these pieces that need to come together. But to be quite honest about it, we have to be able to say that there is going to be criticism from environmental NGOs, and we're going to have to be able to sit down and distinguish where there is valid comment that we need to address and where there's not. And I think one of the difficulties that we've run into in the past is that without being able to have that balanced conversation, without the emotional energy, we end up finding Canadians believing that every comment about environmental sustainability with respect to the oil sands that an environmental NGO makes is valid. And many of them are quite specific to whatever the agenda of that NGO might be. And we need to spend the time publicly talking about the difference between the environmental NGOs who are really concerned about environmental outcomes and the environmental NGOs that simply have a political agenda.
So on that very topic, let's go to one of the biggest issues as of late, Keystone. And a question that's come forward is, what happened? What do you think happens next? Is it dead? When you go to Washington, who do you lobby?
Well, I can't answer any of those questions when Alex is sitting right there and Peter's sitting over there. Well, the first thing I will say is that at this to this point in time, the government of Alberta hasn't lobbied anyone from the perspective that we believe that there's a regulatory process going on in the United States that we have to respect. And we have to respect that because we would expect others to respect that process in our own country. And quite frankly, as we start to move toward Gateway and the regulatory process that Gateway is going to undertake, I want to be in a position where I can say this is a domestic regulatory matter and we're going to deal with it in Canada. So before I start jumping out and start trying to intervene in a domestic regulatory process in the United States, I want to know that I'm going to be able to get the same respect from others that might try to intervene in our process. So that's the first step. But the other step, when I think about what happened with Keystone, I think there was an awful lot of domestic politics involved. I don't think I'm saying anything that anyone here doesn't think or know, that really impacted decisions that probably were far outside of the merits of the project. There's no doubt that the proponents did a tremendously important job and a very good job of dealing with communities that were impacted by the project. We know that very often politics gets in the way, and I think that's what happened in the last month. It's quite interesting now to see what will happen next, because the President was so specific about saying that the reason for this suspension of the process was the fact that Nebraska hadn't been resolved, and then put a date of January 2013. The fact that TransCanada was able to work so well with Nebraska to deal with that issue, I think then leads to the question of what comes next, and whether or not that regulatory process will continue to take until January 2013. I don't know if it will or not, but I am optimistic about the future of the project. I think we are going to see it move ahead, but the politics between now and then, I think, are changing daily, and I'm looking at Alex and he's grinning, so I know that's the case.
So, talking about politics, pipeline project, closer to home, Gateway,
Yeah.
and West Coast access. A number of questions about what you think about that and your degree of optimism there.
Well, 5,400 interveners at the moment. 5,400 interveners. I think they're each going to get 10 minutes. Serious issue partly because I think we needed to do more work in talking about what the foundations were around why we need the pipeline. And we have to have that public discussion right now, that these infrastructure needs are critical to the future economic development of the country. And to me, they then loop back to the Canadian energy strategy discussion. Because I don't think it's appropriate or even necessary for only Alberta or only Alberta interests to be out lobbying with respect to this pipeline or trying to ensure that it succeeds. This is an issue that I think takes on national importance. And my expectation from conversations I've had with people in Ottawa, including the Prime Minister, is that they understand that. And so as we move ahead, part of what we need to do is to be able to talk about why the success of this pipeline becomes critical to our economic success, as I said, in the next 2 years. But as we do that, we'll know, as I said before, that we are going to have to separate the wheat from the chaff. Because we know that there are going to be a number of interveners that have a very particular political agenda, which is very different than the agenda that I think matters to most Canadians, which is the agenda for economic growth, at a time when the rest of the world is in very uncertain circumstances and we just don't have to be.
Shifting gears away from energy for a few moments, you mentioned in your comments that we have to keep in mind the objective of all of this is to have a high quality of life in terms of public and private goods. You're proposing multi-year funding plans in terms of health care and health, municipal services. What will your priorities be there?
Well, without going into too much detail in terms of where we are in the budget process right now, one of the things that has become very clear is that when we talk to any level of government about the decisions that they need to make, whether it's school boards or municipalities in particular, or municipal and district councils, that one of their challenges is that they can't make responsible decisions where they're accountable to the people that voted for them without having some certainty. The certainty is more important than a spending increase. What they need to know is that they have the ability to make strategic decisions in the longer term. And I think that's what Albertans are asking for. So for me, the priority is to ensure that there's certainty so that local decision makers, school boards, municipal governments, are able to actually think about where they need to set their priorities to respond to their local communities. And what we've seen is that when we've been able to give those local decision makers that certainty, it's led to better outcomes, so that we don't see the volatility of teacher cutbacks and teacher hiring, or no ability to plan long term or to obtain financing for municipal infrastructure projects. And being able to do that allows for them to be able to impact the long-term development in their community in a very different way. But for me, and what Albertans have told us, is that the first priority is to continue supporting health care to the level that we have, but to make it work better, which I think everyone would agree needs to happen, and then education. And I'd say health care and education. Third would be infrastructure.
Now, in terms of education and skilled labor, if you might just direct your comments to that, several questions. There's a report recently that our bank released that said in Canada we could create 1 million jobs over the next 20 years just building out the infrastructure projects that we have on the drawing board, energy infrastructure. What are Alberta's long-term plans in terms of immigration, in terms of trades, in terms of skilled labor?
So, the first thing I'll tell you is that my dad was an electrician. And the reason that I'm a lawyer is because my dad thought I should be a lawyer. So, on many of those days that I didn't want to be a lawyer, I'd say to him, "Why did you want me to be a lawyer?" And he said, "Because I grew up in High River and the most successful person in town was a lawyer." And I think we've created a culture, I know, quibble about that, but I think we've created a culture in this province where we've started to believe that success, professional success, means that everybody goes to university. And as a result of that, what we see is actually a really high school dropout rate. Because we're creating a secondary education system that is grooming kids to go to university. And we see an awful lot of kids that aren't on that path. And when we don't give them other options in high school, they leave. And in this economy, they can leave. They can leave without having completed their high school or acquired any further skills and essentially go work in the oil patch in some way, in the energy sector. And so what we need to do, first of all, is we need to change our secondary system so that we're understanding the importance of training people who are interested in going into trades so that they can have productive lives for generations in this province. Now, that is a long-term goal, and that's a challenge, but we still have to do it because it will have long-term benefits for us. Our immigration right now is very challenging on two levels. Even in terms of the skilled workers that you're trying to attract from other parts of the world, the administrative structures are too cumbersome. Cal Dallas has already had meetings with the federal government with respect to this, and I've raised it with the Prime Minister. The federal government right now is going through a process, as we understand it, where they're reassessing some of the work that's been done under the provincial nominee program to see whether or not it's possible to take a look at the kinds of skilled workers that need to be coming to Alberta. And it's one place where we do make the argument that we need to see different treatment in Alberta with respect to immigration. The third piece of that, and we were talking about it at our table, was actually attracting people from other parts of the country. People who are in Ontario who aren't working, frankly, because the economy there will not return as quickly as what we have here. So what we know is that we need to ensure that we're talking about who we are as a community in a different way. And this goes back, from my perspective, to what we're doing with respect to things like the Canadian energy strategy. Because I think some of these discussions that are happening in other parts of the country are so simplistic as people saying, I'm thinking about going to Alberta, and friends and neighbors describing Alberta as this boom town that just extracts resources out of the ground as fast as we possibly can, with no concern for how we're building community or any of the things that we know matter in terms of our quality of life. So we have to do a better job of recruiting people, not people who are going to come out here for 30-day shifts, but people who are going to come out here and make their lives here. And we can do a better job of that than we have, because I think apart from work that individual companies have done, it hasn't been something that we've done as a province as a whole. So those three those three different legs of the strategy, I think, will lead to some better results, some short-term and some long-term, but we still have a long way to go.
When you were a lawyer, did I hear you say there were days when you wished you weren't a lawyer? I hope I didn't hear that correctly, but...
Only when I was articling.
Accountability mechanisms. You spoke about discipline, applying discipline to public expenditures. One of the questions is, how are you going to do that? How are you going to make sure that our public funds are spent as effectively as possible?
When I became Premier and we put in a new cabinet, we appointed a new Chief Deputy Minister of Executive Council named Peter Watson, and some of you will know him. What we talked about on that very first day that he came in was the fact that we actually need to change fiscal structures and budget process in the government of Alberta. And the reason for that is that we've created a culture, which I think does sometimes happen in organizations that have been in place for a long time, where we've continued to do the same things the same way for a very long period of time. And so what I would see, and I think many of you might be familiar with this, every year at budget time would be a presumption that when a government department came forward to Treasury Board, that their starting base would be their previous year's budget, and then they would simply add on wherever they either saw a political priority or growth pressures. We have spent a fair amount of time, and Ron's here somewhere, I know, because where's Ron? I don't know, Ron Lightbert. There we are. Sitting quietly. We've spent, Ron has spent a significant amount of time pulling back that process so that the dynamic of Treasury Board is no longer that. And that's where we need to begin. We need to go back and begin to think about whether or not the programs that we're spending money on are actually achieving the outcomes that we need them to achieve. And I know that for many in this room, that really isn't a revolutionary approach. But I will tell you that there is work to be done in government with respect to that. That we have to pull back and really think about the services that we're providing, why we're trying to provide them, and what we want those outcomes to be. And we're doing it very quickly, and it's not going to happen overnight. But there is a change in philosophy in terms of how we deliver and why we deliver. And we will also, I will tell you, be able to see a very clear signal of difference in terms of the information and the advice that we're getting from the public service. Because we've transformed a number of leadership positions in the public service. A number of deputy ministers have moved, a number of deputy ministers have retired. And I will tell you that it sent a signal to the public service that government needs to be delivering differently. We've begun that process. You'll see part of that in the budget, and there will be more to follow.
A couple of tough questions will come too, but one, what's been the most rewarding thing in your first 50 days as Premier?
Oh, boy. You know, I have been amazed by Albertans' generosity, their excitement about the future, the number of comments I've had from people about how what has happened represents a change that many Albertans believed had already happened in the province and that we as politicians were catching up with. That's what I felt in my heart as we were going through this process. And to see Albertans be truly excited and optimistic about the future has been fantastic. The other thing that's been really exciting is the number of Albertans who've talked about how proud they are to be Canadians, and to always remind me that when we talk about who we are, that the first thing we want to do is to be strong national citizens. And I think there's something quite electric right now about how people are feeling about the future. And I've got to say that in these economic times, that's quite a thing. And it says something about just what our potential will be.
Last one. Okay. That takes us to the subject of electricity, and a question, can you elaborate on the electricity transmission review process rate and how it will affect ratepayers?
I'm writing a speech about that right now. I truly am, because we went through a process in Alberta where we began to think differently about transmission, and that was a good thing, because it ensured that we were being strategic and forward-thinking about not just what we were building, but how we were paying for what we were building. We have a challenge right now in this province in that we are still, even in these economic times, growing so quickly, and there is such a demand for electricity that we can't afford to slow down. Now, I said, and many will have heard me say during the leadership campaign, that Bill 50 was an unfortunate piece of legislation. It was too bad that we had to introduce it. But the reason that we had to introduce it was because we hadn't done enough work on building the infrastructure in time for the projects that needed to have the transmission put in place. And I do believe that we are behind the 8 ball in terms of transmission and building critical transmission. So as we move ahead, one of the things that Albertans have asked is, please explain to us the economic need for the transmission. Explain why we need it. And I believe that as we move ahead with that discussion over the next 3 or 4 months, and we're going to put in place a panel to review the economic need for transmission, that we're going to be able to see very clearly why that transmission build is needed, and ensuring that people can see the connection between why we need the transmission and our long-term economic development. Now, the other thing that I want to do is really take a look at whether or not the electricity grid that we currently have reflects what the energy sources in this province are. And I've talked about renewables, talked about wind and solar, talked about local generation. This is an economy that needs so much power right now that it is actually possible to have a grid that contemplates all of those things for consumers. And it's possible for us to build that in a way that's going to ensure that cost to consumers is what consumers expect to pay, and not be a price that's imposed based on an outdated grid that people don't understand.
Ladies and gentlemen, we want to respect people's time. Like you, I would love to hear this much later into the afternoon, the Premier's thoughtful comments. We've covered as much ground as we can, though. The Premier and her office have asked me to assure you that the questions we've not responded to, you will hear back from her office and herself. So thank you very much.
Thank you.